to Quantum Information Computing Science and Technology, India's Center of Excellence in Quantum Technologies. She also leads the QMed Tech Foundation, T-Hub, contributing significantly to India's national quantum mission. With a PhD from Cornell and postdoctoral research at MIT, Professor Saha brings expertise in nanophotonics, quantum sensing, and NV center based gyroscopes. Her contributions have earned recognition from DST, INSA, and IIT Bombay. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Kasturi Saha. We are excited to hear from you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Atri, for this invitation and the very kind words and introduction. So let me try sharing my screen. Allow share window. Okay. No, one second. Let me just go. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, ma'am, but yeah, we can see your screen now.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, good. So we've lost a little bit of time, but so today I will, this is the first lecture on going from classical to quantum sensing. So today's talk is primarily going to be about, a little bit more of classical detection than quantum detection. Okay, because we have to set the stage for understanding what quantum sensing is about, and then to do that we have to first have take a step back and really understand what classical sensing is about. So, as already introduced, I'm Kasturi from the Department of Electrical Engineering at IIT Bombay, and I'm the project director for the National Quantum Mission's T Hub on Quantum Sensing and Metrology. Okay. So given this, let me just start with this little picture here, cartoon here, that as we all understand today, we are really dependent on various different types of sensors, strewn around in our very much day-to-day life, right? And the picture that you see here, so let me just use a pointer option here. Say the pointer. So this picture that you can see here is of a digital thermometer. Now, I'm sure since the sad days of
Please, your
COVID,
voice is not audible.
hello, can you hear me?
Still, it's not audible.
Hello,
We can
hello.
hear you, ma'am.
Yes, you can.
Okay, okay. Can I continue?
Yeah, sure, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a picture of a, standard classical thermometer that you are very familiar with now. So you basically they just shine a laser pointer pretty much and just it's like a thermal detector here that is in this thermometer. Now nowadays with EVs and self-driven cars. As you can understand, the way the self-driving really happens is by sensing its environment, and that is position, acceleration, velocity, and all of this together. And so that means it's a combination of various different types of sensors, along with a very important tool, which is the GPS. Which is incorporated within a self-driving car, right? So these are all different types of sensors that are very much in use today, along with other type of sensors like magnetic field sensors. Now, the magnetic compass is one of the oldest kind of sensors that we are probably aware of, which senses the magnetic north pole. And then, as you can also see, this is a bar magnet, and if you remember from the very beginning or school kind of experiments that we had done, if you just threw around some iron particles, they form these very nice magnetic field lines. So if you bring a bar magnet close to the compass needle, you will see that this needle also sort of fluctuates, right? So this is a magnetic field sensor in that sense. So these are all different types of examples of classical sensors. Here there is a quantum aspect also, but then mostly these are all classical sensors that we are talking about. And classical sensing is very much part of our daily lives. Now, let's look into this. What is what is now the next stage of sensing? The next stage of sensing is essentially quantum sensing. And this is a picture I'm pretty much sure that all of you are probably familiar with. This is an MRI machine. And MRI machines essentially work on the very principles of quantum mechanics. That is, we perturb is when a body is placed here, there is you know human body has a lot of water content, and the water the hydrogen molecules inside, or the water molecules inside, are actually perturbed with a little magnetic pulse, and then we look at the response of it, and this is very much a quantum phenomena. So this is a quantum sensing mechanism that is used for forming images of tissues and different kinds of parts of the body. Now this is an image of an atomic clock that is placed in NIST in Boulder, and also in NIST in Gaithersburg in the United States. And this is essentially the atomic clock that keeps time for the world. Okay. And this is also, again, very much a quantum technology. There are other examples of such quantum technologies, and one of them is, of course, the LIGO, which senses the gravitational field. And the reason it is able to sense these very, very tiny, tiny changes because of a gravitational to what is interacting with each other and perturbing the gravitational field. You can sense it because we use squeeze light here, and this is very much a quantum phenomenon. Another example is OCT. OCT is basically tomography of the eye. If you have ever gotten a retina scan done, you essentially, so this is a retina scan, you look into different defects in the retina, if there is any deformation that is happening. And this is being sensed because of entangled photons. Okay. Similarly, there's another example which is called the PET scan, positron emission tomography, that is also used for cancer diagnosis. And this is another example where quantum features are actually used. So these are examples of quantum technologies, but the quantum revolution really started with the very first quantum revolution, and the quantum 1.0, which was essentially understanding or using very fundamental properties of matter, or to study structures like the superconductivity, or understanding BECs, or forming different kind of understanding phase, etc. On the application side, the inventions of things like lasers, transistors, ICs, etc., etc., etc. These are all again examples of quantum 1.0. And these are technologies that have been developed from using quantum 1.0. Now, we want to go to the next revolution, which is quantum 2.0 of sensing, where we want to build devices that can sense, what do we really want to achieve is better sensitivity, better accuracy, better precision of the measurement. And that is where really we want to harness the quantum properties of materials to be able to execute these tasks. Okay. So the detection task. Now, there could be many different things that we would like to sense. For instance, it could be temperature, it could be magnetic field, it could be electric field, it could be strain, and these are all different types of parameters: acceleration, gravity, and time. So these are some of the very fundamental things that we would like to sense, and these are what defines what is known as quantum sensing and metrology. So now there are two words here: sensing and metrology. Metrology, I want to start with, is essentially measurement of precision, or essentially something that we do for example, of timekeeping. Timekeeping is a precision task, meaning that you have to do something. You always see that your atomic clocks are becoming better and better, meaning they can measure second to 10 to the power of 19th order. Okay, so uh, precision, right? So that is one of the things. Similarly, mass, like kilogram, how you define kilogram or how you define all your SI units is what comes under the purview of what is known as quantum metrology. Whereas quantum sensing is essentially literally just sensing. So sensing with very high accuracy and precision and sensitivity is your magnetic field, temperature, acceleration, gravity. These are all things that you sense physical parameters, then you're essentially, you call it sensing. So sensing metrology go hand in hand. There's also imaging, which also falls under the purview of quantum sensing. So imaging is essentially using photons to do sense the environment, image the environment, and that is where so quantum sensing, imaging, and metrology all go together in this entire domain of quantum sensing. Okay, now I will start with some very basics and very foundations of how we can do quantum measurements. And I'm pretty sure you would be looking into this in various different talks throughout this entire few days. And at the foundation of whatever quantum mechanics we really do, we simplify everything down to ultimately two-level systems. And two-level systems are nothing but a ground state and an excited state. Now, these two-level systems could be anything. So, for instance, it could be for photons, it could be the horizontal and vertical polarizations of photons. It could be just the atom, which is the ground and the excited state. And this, I'm pretty sure that you are aware of, that every atom has, the highest filled state, which is the ground state. And then the next level that is unfilled is essentially its first excited state. And then you can have many more number of unfilled levels, which will finally become its many, many more number of excited states that you can. So, for instance, the hydrogen, which is 1s, it has one electron in the ground state, and then you have the your next state that you have, the 2s is the excited state, right? So that is the ground and excited state. So this could be a two-level system, and every atomic system that we work with essentially has a ground state and an excited state. And finally, what we mostly look at are just the ground and the first excited states. Then you also have another class of very familiar things that we use for sensing are spins. Spins which are spin up and down, and spins are, as you know, or I'm not sure too much of the kind of audience level. The spin is a very quantum mechanical object. It cannot be described by anything that is classical. Every electron has a spin up or spin down, and no two electrons with the same spin state can occupy the same state, right? So spin up and spin down, these spins actually will couple to the environment and can be used as sensors. Similarly, atoms also couple to some environment and behave like sensors. Photons, on the other hand, don't really couple to anything, but photons can be used in various different other ways. And really can be used for imaging. So photons are primarily mostly used for imaging, or photons can be a mechanism by which you can extract some other information through the photons, because it could be something that is indirectly coupled to a parameter that you're trying to sense. All right. So, but atoms and spins generally, these have direct coupling. For instance, atoms are typically used for these Rydberg atoms, for instance, typically used for electric field sensing, and spins are typically used for magnetic field sensing, sometimes also for electric field sensing, and sometimes also for charge sensing, right? So these are all examples. Now I will come to these more in detail in terms of applications, perhaps later on. But this is just to give you an overview of the kind of the simplicity of the system that we are going to actually use for sensing. Now, a two-level system can be represented on the block sphere, and block sphere is just a visual representation or a geometric representation of a quantum mechanical system. We are not deriving anything of the block sphere or how the block sphere really comes. You can look into any textbook of quantum mechanics, whether it's Griffiths or Sakurai. You will see that a simple two-level system can be defined in terms of a block sphere, where the north pole is essentially the zero state and the south pole is the one state. And any point on this sphere is nothing but a superposition of the zero and one state. And that is why you can see that there could be any phases which can be defined by theta and phi, which can define a new state. And now you can also apply some pulses and you can control the state of the system from 0 uh, to 1 by typically this is called pi pulse. Pi because you make a pi shift from 0 to 1. So this is a pi. The angle theta is a pi and therefore it's a pi shift. So it's called a pi pulse. If you want to move the state from 0 to 0 plus I one state, or this is a superposition state, then you essentially apply a pi over 2 pulse. And then you can have the spin or whatever your two-level system on the equator. Now, this is a very good visual picture for everybody to keep in mind, because this is how we control our states and this is how we will be doing most of our measurements. What we typically do is really just use create these kind of states and then let the states evolve over time, and then they pick up some environmental things, and then from there we can redo some measurements and we can understand what the changes have happened on the qubit. And as you can see, this is now I can start calling it as a qubit because it's nothing but a 0 and a 1. So it's a quantum bit. So 0 and 1 together. So it's a quantum bit. And you can look at the different evolutions of these quantum bits to see what kind of environmental interactions it may have. And from there you can sense. Now, there's a catch here. Most of the time, what you will see is that qubits are used will require very high fidelity, meaning that state, if you create a state, it must remain that state. But most of the time, it doesn't. It decoheres. But it decoheres also because it is interacting with the environment. So a sensor is somewhere in between, where you want the system to interact with the environment, but you don't want it to interact so quickly that it will completely destroy the state. So it's like a double-edged sword. So you want it, but at the same time, you don't want it too sharp, and therefore it will completely be protected from the environment. Then you won't be able to sense the environment. And you're mostly likely to sense an environment when there is a certain coupling with the environment. And that is what we're trying to understand. So that's how you use a simple two-level system. We will, of course, go much more in detail when tomorrow in tomorrow's lecture when I talk about magnetic field sensing. But today, we are really just going to focus on the very fundamentals of, detection, and some of the things that are related to detection and sensing, and some of the mathematical foundations that are required to understand for doing some kind of parameter estimation. All right. Just to again sort of give more of a little bit of a pictorial understanding of what the different type of systems we are talking about here. So you have trapped ion systems here, and then we have optical lattices. These can also be, these can also be your your atoms that can be in ground and excited state. You can have the photonic qubits, quantum dots, and other examples. Superconducting qubits are also an example. Uh, and then NMR, which is the oldest kind of quantum systems that we are aware of, where you can use different kind of molecules and the nuclear spins in them to sense the environment. So this is something that these are all examples of the two-level systems that we are talking about, and typically available and have been developed worldwide. Okay. Now I will really focus on classical detection, because to understand quantum detection, one has to understand classical detection, classical noise, and really the information is truly in the noise. The noise is really the signal, and that is what Landauer said. And it is in understanding the noise that we understand how it works and behaves with, the environment, and how it really can detect, right? And you want to detect something beyond the noise. Uh, for that, you have to understand the noise itself. To characterize what is the sensitivity of your measurement, you have to understand what are the things that limit your sensitivity. And to understand that, we must understand classical detection first. So I'm going to take a very simple example of a photo detector and really talk about noise. Now, the kind of noise that I'm going to mention here will be applicable to any detection that we do later on in any, or most rather, the types of noise will be mostly applicable to, various different systems. There may be changes from one system to the other, depending on how you are doing the detection itself, how you're sensing, in fact. But at the end of the day, the classification of noise and how you handle noise, or what is your understanding of noise, how do you understand sensitivity, these concepts overall remain the same. And therefore, photo detector is something, because it's a very classical device, it's a good starting point to understand classical nature of detection, and then go into the quantum nature of detection. Okay. So there could be two different types of photodetectors that you may be probably aware of. One is a thermal detector that converts the energy into heat, and from the heat, it's like a thermal detector. You may have seen many kind of thermal detectors. IR detectors are mostly thermal detectors. Uh, then you also have photocurrent detectors, meaning if you shine light on a device and then it converts it into a current, and you detect it either through photoelectric effect or a photoconductive effect. Okay, so these are two possibilities. So by which, or two mechanisms by which you can really convert the essentially the light into something that you can read off. So you can have a current. So from current, you can convert to a voltage, and you can read out the voltage, whether it's analog readout or digital readout. It doesn't matter. And similarly, you can have the light that can be converted into heat, and from the heat you can detect what is the change, and you can convert it back. Now, as you can see, this is always when you want to measure light, this is it's what you're measuring is not directly what you're trying to really assess. So you want to measure the number of photons, but what you're not measuring is not really the number of photons, but something which is the current, which is different from the actual parameter. So this is something that you have to keep in mind when you're doing measurements, because you're not directly measuring the number of photons here. So this is something that we have to understand, because ultimately when you start quantifying things down, there is a relationship that we have to take into account, or a model that we have to build as to how exactly is this number of photons really related to the current. Okay, so similarly, so in this photo detector, I'm pretty much sure that you would have seen these different kinds of photo detectors. If you haven't seen, just go to Thorlab's website. This is from Thorlab's website. Now I'm just taking an example. This is quite arbitrary. You can go into any companies that sell photo detectors and look into their website, and you will see there is a whole lot of different types of photo detectors that are available here. And some of the things that you have to notice here are essentially parameters that define this kind of a photo detector. Now, there will be a wavelength range. It's not like every photo detector will be able to detect every photon of every frequency. There is always going to be some wavelength range or bandwidth that it will be applicable. You cannot have a universal photo detector. That is just not possible. Uh, then you have to. Then there could be parameters like active area. So what is really the area which is able to capture the number of photons and can tell you what is the corresponding current that you are sensing, or what is the sensing area, what is the active sensing area that you can work with. Similarly, you have a response time or rise and fall time, meaning when I shine the light on the detector, or for instance on the surface, does it instantaneously tell me what the number of photon is, or it has a certain amount of time after which it can only tell me that this is a suitable device or not? Then there is what is known as NEP. This is your noise floor, and it tells you exactly, what is your baseline noise, above which only you can detect the signal. There's also a dark current typically. So dark current is essentially whatever your background current is, and that is your dark current. And similarly, there could be something very specific to the type of the detector, which is your junction capacitance, etc. Now, as you can see, there's a vast range of detectors that are available, and this is again only a very small subset of the kind of visible wavelength photo detectors that are available. Now, there could be IR, X-ray, all sorts of different types of detectors, and also in the range, like what is the power, right? So, what is the watts per square hertz? What is your uh, baseline power that you can really detect? That is something that we have to be very careful. As you can see, this is a very classical detector because it cannot detect a single photon at all. The closest that comes to a single photon detector on average is an avalanche photodiode. But if you truly want to detect a single photon, which is a quantum mechanical, so then there we have to use these superconducting nanowire devices. Right? And those work in a completely different regime. All of these different kind of photodetectors work in different mechanisms. But today I choose to just talk about a standard photodetector. Now, you can also have photoelectric effect, where essentially there is some light and that leads to an electron ejection, and finally that leads to a current. And you can have PMTs with multiple different such so it can photo multiply. So this is a multiplier tube. So that's why you have multiple different dinodes or anodes, and this leads to an amplification of the current. So this is a standard photoelectric effect. But what is also most commonly used in some of the cheapest detectors is essentially the photoconductivity. Okay. So what is photoconductivity? Photoconductivity means that if you shine some light, which is energy h bar omega, uh, to a semiconductor, which has some band gap here. The electrons from the valence band go up to the conduction band, and then it can be used. So there's an electron hole pair generation. So this can lead to photoconductivity, right? So you may have semiconductors which can lead to the generation of electron hole pair. When you shine some light, you can have electron hole pairs that are created, and this finally leads to photocurrent, and that is what you sense with an external circuit, right? So and then you can also have an avalanche effect, which is impact through impact ionization, and that's a different mechanism altogether. Okay, so this is a standard PN junction. So a photodiode is nothing but a standard PN junction. I'm sure all of you would have seen it. When you apply some bias, there is, if you apply a positive bias or negative bias, depending on that, there is charge accumulation that happens. And typically, photodiode works in the reverse bias region. As you can see, this is the IV characteristic of a standard PN junction, and this is how the current is typically related to the voltage that is applied. This is the conventional photodetector. So when you shine some light on it in the reverse bias, what you see is that there is some dark current, of course, but then if you shine some light on it, there is generation of electrons and hole pairs, and that is what you sense, and you convert it into a photocurrent and you sense as a photodetector. Okay, now typically when you have these kind of reverse bias, a strong reverse bias generally creates a strong electric field to increase the drift velocity, thus reducing the transit time. Increasing the width of the depletion layer, which reduces the capacitance and improves the response times. Remember, capacitance always causes long response time. Then increasing the width of the depletion layer leads to a larger photosensitive area, making it easier to collect light. So you also want it to have a large photosensitive area, and so that you can collect as much more light as possible in the reverse bias region and be able to generate these electron hole pairs, and this will tell you exactly how much of current that you're able to measure. Now remember, photons are being indirectly measured here. So it's a photo current that you have, and the model is the IV characteristics that you use. So you basically apply some photons, some current is now generated based on the number of photons, and that is what you're sensing in this photo detection, right? So given this, there are some parameters that we now have to really understand, something called quantum efficiency, okay? So as you understand that the probability of a single photon on a device generating a photocarrier pair that contributes to the photodetector. Not all photons that fall onto the photodetector will naturally lead to the creation of photoelectron hole pair. It is not necessary, right? It is a probabilistic process. Every photon that falls on it, there is some ratio of those photons that fall on it will be absorbed and then will create these electron hole pairs, and that will lead to a current. So as you can see, there is some efficiency already that is coming into the picture. So every time a photon falls, 100% of that will not lead to electron hole pair. So why is that true? Not all photons are absorbed. So probabilistic nature of absorption process of the semiconductor. There could be issues with reflection at the surface. There could be recombination inside the semiconductors. So these are all reasons why an electron hole pair may not be generated. And in different materials, these can have different types of ratios. And therefore, if you look at the spectrum of the different kind of materials that form photodetectors, you will see that the quantum efficiency that is defined is very different from material to material, and it really specifically depends on certain materials, certain band gap, etc., etc. Right? Plus the fact that the photon itself, when it falls, it's a Poisson process itself. So photons themselves are Poisson, so they don't arrive at the same time. Right, so it's a Poissonian process, and so therefore, neither do they always arrive as singles. Right, so this is all a Poissonian. So there is an inherent probabilistic nature in the light itself, and then you also have the probabilistic nature of the generation of electron and hole pairs. All right. So thus, we can now define what is known as the efficiency, which is 1 minus R, where R is the optical reflection. Suppose if you don't have R, then some of it would be, a fraction of it would just get absorbed. So there is some loss happening because of that. And then you have, so this is the overall expression that you get, and this is the fraction of, finally the fraction of
Take a break. Take a break. Have some water.
sorry, I'm just recovering from a flu, so
So just take a break, madam. Just take a break, have some water, and then get back to them.
yeah, yeah. Okay, I think I should be okay. I'm just still recovering from a flu, so uh, yeah. Um, okay, let's go back. So here we have the quantum efficiency of a material. This is essentially, again, going back, this is the fraction of electron hole pairs that are successfully going to contribute to the detector current. So as you can see, it's also wavelength dependent because the every semiconductor has a different band gap, and that band gap is directly going to tell you what is the energy that is going to be absorbed and beyond which you will get a photocurrent. So this is very important. So that is why the semiconductor materials themselves have a certain wavelength range, and it can only operate within a certain wavelength range. Not all materials can become photodetectors, neither all materials can become useful as solar cells. Right? So this is something that is very inherent to the material itself. Uh, so the next thing is really the responsivity. Okay, it is really the comparison of current flow to incident optical power. So if you have some kind of, so if you have a certain power that is falling onto the photodetector, which you can write as h nu times phi. This is the phi, is essentially the flux. And then you have R, which is the proportionality factor for, or the responsivity, right? How much of the power really gets converted to the current? So that's why most of the time the responsivity is always defined in terms of amps per watt. And it will, if you look at a photodetector specification, you will find that it is given in terms of responsivity is given in terms of the ampere per watt. So if you need, if you apply certain power, then how much of current is going to be generated, because you're going to measure the current, right? You're not going to measure the power itself directly, but from the current you will be able to then back calculate the power, because you want to measure the power using this photodetector, right? So that is what responsivity really tells you. And so most of the time when you buy a photodetector, you use this responsivity number as a calibrated number that the spec sheet will already tell you. And from there, you will you shine some light, and you know that if you get X amount of ampere or of current, then this is the ampere per watt conversion ratio is already given to you. You will be able to calculate the exact power that you can then back calculate. Now, most photodetectors also have some gain media, and therefore there is a gain factor also incorporated in this. So then the responsivity then scales with this gain factor. So you can also calculate the responsivity. So responsivity is a very key parameter for for a photodetector. Just like you have the quantum efficiency. Efficiency tells you how many photons get really converted into the current. Then the responsivity tells you how much current do I expect given a certain amount of power that is falling onto the photodetector. The next thing is time, of course. How fast can I detect? And different kinds of detectors have different kinds of timing, and this transit time really is very spread out time for the electron hole generated pair to move through the semiconductor. Okay, so this is the transit time. Another limit to response time is the RC time constant from the resistance and capacitance of the photodetector and other circuitry. So remember that it's not just the semiconductor. You have the other part of the circuitry that is also involved. You have to collect the current as well, right? That is generated, and you have to measure it. And for that, you basically have to calculate this response time. Right, so this is now based on the number of elements in your circuit, you can have different response time, and people are trying to really increase this response time as fast as possible. Okay, the next thing is responsivity. Okay, here you can see that different material have different kind of responsivity. And now we've talked about this ampere watt, but as you can see, different material will have different kinds of responsivity. It is also wavelength dependent. Okay, so there is not a uniform responsivity for every material in a photodetector, and this is very much a material property that you have to keep in mind for choosing the right kind of photodetector for sensing the right kind of wavelength that you want to measure, right? So these are some of the very fundamental characteristics of a photodetector. Now, there is the dark current. So as you already know, there is a very minimal amount of bias. In the reverse bias, there's always a dark current that is flowing, and this exists even with no incident photons. And immediately you can make out that this is a source of noise, because it is always going to be there, and it's an uncertainty in your measurement. So this is the first noise parameter that we actually encounter in a photodetector measurement. Okay. Now we really have to understand that what are the sources of noise that we might encounter when we are using this kind of a photodetector. Because ultimately, all our measurements are going to be limited. As you saw, that there's a minimum noise parameter that is already present, and so beyond that only we can detect some signal. So what are the different kinds of noise that are that we are going to encounter? One is the photon noise, which is the fundamental noise. Okay, so associated with the arrival of the photons, it is usually described by a Poisson statistics. Now the way I'm sure Aditi Di was speaking before me, so she would have already spoken to you a little bit about photons. Uh, when you have different photons, or if you have a single photon versus you have bunched or anti-bunched photons, they have different kind of statistics. Your standard classical photons or your coherent kind of nature photons, they always have Poissonian statistics. Okay, so they arrive in bunches, and sometimes and they always follow this Poissonian statistics. So naturally there is a noise that is associated with the photons themselves, right? So this is photon noise. Then you have photoelectron noise. Given that a photon arrives, you have a probabilistic nature of the semiconductor absorb and then generate. So when quantum efficiency is less than 1, the generation of the photoelectron pair is also probabilistic. This is also a source of noise. Right. So this is definitely one of the sources of noise. So photoelectron noise is also another source. Then along with this, you also have gain noise in the photodetector with gain amplification process is also random. Each photon generates a random number G of carriers with an average value G bar, but the uncertainty really depends on the amplification process itself. So for instance, in a PMT, you have multiple different electrons that are being generated from different diodes. Now that itself is a random process. So that gain process is also a random process, and that could also lead to noise. And then there could be anything in the circuit, that electrical components will add noise, etc., from the readout itself. So these are also all different types of noise that are available or possible in this kind of. So when you're doing a sensing, so suppose, for instance, why are we going through this entire exercise of understanding what the noise is? So if you have, if you're sensing temperature, for instance, using an IR camera, right, or a thermal camera, then you're imaging the photons. So obviously from the photons, all of these parameters will then become, will be corrupting your signal or your temperature assessment, right? So therefore it is important to understand the noise in your measurement. And as we talk about quantum sensors, this is one of the most important things that we always have to work the highest amount, is to understand what is the sensitivity of my quantum sensor. To calibrate that sensitivity, I must understand each on individual, each and every noise parameter or each and every noise source that can be applicable to my system. So if you go to, say, National Physical Laboratory in Delhi, or if you go to any of the national physical laboratories across the world, or NIST, what they're essentially doing is literally sitting down and calibrating and understanding noise in every single point, at every single point, and really trying to then relate it back to the sensitivity, the accuracy, and the precision of the measure. Okay, what you measure and what you use it for is the next step. But to develop the quantum sensor, you have to really understand each of these parameters. Okay, there are other sources like the background noise, the dark current noise. These are all important noise that are present in the system. There is also next the signal to noise ratio. So beyond your noise, what is your signal? So the noise is typically, you will see that the noise actually could average out to possibly zero, but the variance of the noise will not average out to zero. So noise is always calibrated in terms of variance. Okay, and SNR for the photon number is given by this. The minimum detectable signal is when SNR is equal to 1. Right, so if you have when you are just at the noise level, then your SNR is 1, and then you want to detect above that noise level. Okay, this is just a pictorial understanding of short noise, which is the most fundamental noise. As you can see, I mean, of all the electrical noise, etc., you can eliminate all of this, but you cannot eliminate the fundamental source of noise, which is the photons themselves. So the photon short noise, or as you go from the photon to the electron, that short noise itself cannot be eliminated. So this is where this is fundamental to really the calibration. So this is a term that you would hear a lot if you look into read papers about quantum sensing. Is the first thing that everybody asks is, what is the short noise in your system? That is the baseline noise that you can deal with, and then everything is about that. So if you reach the photon short noise, then that is the fundamental limit in your system, unless you go beyond it, which is if you use some kind of entanglement process or something that will enable you to go beyond the short noise or the quantum limit. Okay. So I won't go really into the details of all of this. You will find these kind of details in many textbooks that are very much available for standard classical detection. So photon noise is the mean number of photons. Then you have photoelectron noise is the efficiency multiplied by the mean number of photons. So efficiency meaning the quantum efficiency here. So then you have the photocurrent noise, which is nothing but the efficiency times the flux divided by the bandwidth. So this is your photocurrent flux. And finally, all of these put together, you can calibrate this entire system for a given bandwidth with a given number of photons. You have a given quantum efficiency and a given photon flux. You have a well calibrated photo detector system. All right. There are some other things that you have to keep in mind. For instance, for a photo detector, there is thermal noise, also known as Johnson noise or Nyquist noise. This arises really due to the random motion of the mobile carriers in the material itself. And this can have a certain power spectral density, meaning it can have some kind of a wavelength dependence of it. So this is given by this kind of an expression. Uh, then there are other types of noise like flicker noise, pink noise, which is 1 over f noise, white noise, which means that you have for every wavelength, you have a constant spectrum. So these are the different kinds of the power spectral density is constant, meaning for every wavelength there is some existing noise, right? So this is a white noise. Then you have the Johnson-Nyquist noise, essentially the thermal fluctuations of charge and increasing the temperature, and all of these are related to each other. There can be flicker noise because of different kind of defect in the material, fluctuating traps inside the material, domain structures, magnetic material. These all lead to flicker noise. And so if you read the development of any kind of detector, you will see different kinds of frequency plots which tell you that with frequency, what is really the noise that is present in your system, and how is it really changing with frequency, whether it is a 1 over f, whether it's 1 over f squared, or it has a certain probability density. These are things that one has to calibrate, and there are many methods of calibrating these systems, which today we will not go into. But just to give you an example, suppose you just shine some torch on a photo detector, and you can all do this at home if you or in the labs. You can get a photo detector and you can shine some torch, and you will see that this is the kind of noise spectra that you will see on if you're measuring the Johnson-Nyquist noise, or this is, for example, of a flicker noise. Of course, this is in time domain. You have to go to the frequency domain to see the 1 over f noise. Now, how do you get rid of noise? Well, some noise can be taken care of with what is known as common mode rejection. So meaning if you have two detectors that are sensing the same thing with the same balanced kind of power, then you can subtract out that noise. But that is not true for short noise. Okay, you cannot subtract out short noise. You have to. These are things that, for instance, if you have any common mode noise, for instance, a laser noise, which is a source that you are trying to detect, it has a common mode noise that you can actually subtract out. And if you're using that laser for detecting like a small spectra, then you can free up your spectra of the background noise that is coming because, or common mode noise that is coming because of the source that you're using for your excitation, then that can be detected out. And this can be used for, a balance detector can be used for this kind of a detection. Okay, now I want to summarize this part of the classical detection that we have discussed so far. So far, we've looked at photo detector, the very basic concept, and then you have figures of merit and the noises and the sources of noises. Uh, as I mentioned here, truly these photodetectors don't detect single photons. To detect single photons, we go to a very specific regime of using what is known as photon number resolving detectors or bolometers or superconducting nanowire detectors. These are actually quantum detectors where not only is your source truly quantum, but also your detection process is truly quantum. In the case of the detectors that we saw so far, the process, those detectors are very classical because it's a semiconductor process. And of course, you just have the electron hole pair generation. Although there is inherent noise in the process, and there is merit to understanding the sources of noise in this, because it is classical noise as well as quantum noise are all present in different in all systems that you essentially use for sensing. Therefore, you have to really study each of these parameters as much in depth as much as the quantum processes themselves. Okay, now let's go back again to our quantum two-level system. We will now use this two-level system to do some kind of a parameter estimation. Okay, now so far we use the photodetector as a parameter. The we were estimating was the photons that we were detecting through a semiconductor process. Suppose if I were to detect something else, what is really the meaning of parameter estimation and what is the math behind this parameter estimation is what we're going to study in the next 30 minutes or so, and try to understand and capture what is the type of measurement that I will do to get the best out of of these measurements that I want to really carry out. So how do I design my measurements is what we are going to study by looking at what is known as quantum parameter estimation. Now I'm going to go in a little bit of a flipped way. Uh, so I'm going to first tell you about an example of quantum parameter estimation uh, using a two-level system. So suppose if I have a qubit, which is a 0 and 1, and what I'm going to do is try to measure a magnetic field. All right. So the way I do it is I start with a spin qubit, and this is just an example that I'm giving you. I start with a spin qubit. I create a superposition by applying some pi over 2 pulse. And what I'm going to then do is let this spin see some environmental magnetic field. Now, I don't know if you all of you know, but spins couple to magnetic field through what is known as the Zeeman coupling, or as represented here, this is the spin and this is the magnetic field. This is the gyromagnetic ratio, gamma. So gamma B is essentially telling you if you apply B, this is the amount of coupling that is happening, and this is the Hamiltonian for this spin which is pointing in the direction of the B. It need not be, but this is just a very simplified case. So the phase that the spin is going to acquire, meaning if I have a superposition, then over time, so let me go back again here. So if I prepare the superposition in this state, which is 0, 1, this phase here, this I here, this is e to the power something. So if I here, so this phase between the 0 and the 1 is essentially going to change because the spin now which couples to this magnetic field will cause the phi to change here. So this angle phi is actually going to change. So this phi is the same as this phi here. So this phi is now dependent on gamma B and the amount of time that you let the spin actually evolve. Now, this is a real example. So this is how we use spins for measuring magnetic field. And this is a very simple experiment, which is called the Ramsey experiment, where you prepare the spin and you apply a pi over 2 pulse to create the superposition. And then you let the spins acquire this phase. And then you apply another pi over 2 pulse to measure the phase difference and this phase. And then you, sorry. Yeah, so you can acquire a phase phi. And this phase is then measured again. And then from this phase, if you measure the phase, you know the time, you know the gyromagnetic ratio, it is constant for an electron. Then you can calculate the B. So essentially you use this qubit to measure the B field that is in the environment because it is interacting with the spin here. Okay, so this is called a simple Ramsey experiment. Now, the question that I can ask is, what is the lowest or the smallest B field that I can measure? And how can I quantify this? So how do I know what are the bounds on my system? Now, there is something called the Cramer-Rao bound, and that is what we're going to just see in the next few slides coming up, that what is this bound on the system? What is the meaning of the short noise limited sensitivity that tells me what is exactly going to be the bound on the system? In a nutshell, I can just tell you from this parameter here is that delta B will depend on the variance of the signal, and then it is the rate of change of signal with the B or the slope. Okay, the variance of the actual error on the signal that you measure divided by the slope, which is how much does the signal actually change with respect to B. Now, where does this actually come from is what we're going to see in the next few slides itself. But before that, the standard way we do some measurements is essentially when you take a classical average, meaning that you repeat some measurement over time. You know that there is a certain noise, but you know that if you keep averaging, it will go down as 1 over square root of n, meaning the number of measurements that you do, you can repeat those number of measurements. Or you can also have n number of qubits and then prepare them all in the same way. Let them all acquire the phase. And what you finally get is an delta B, which is given by 1 over square root of n, which is essentially like a classical average. There is nothing really quantum here, okay? This is very much classical. The process is quantum, meaning you're using the qubits to do the measurement, for instance, in the example of a B field here. But the methodology which you're using to get the B field or the minimum B field is actually very much classical because this is just a square root n dependence. This is your standard average law. The same thing can be done if you do m number of such small measurements of tau, and this will go as tau n tau t square root n. Okay, so this is the bound that you get on doing m kind of repetitions. Okay, so now the question is that how does quantum help in such kind? What really will it do if you use a quantum metrology or quantum sensing, right? What you can do is instead of using just a qubit, you can prepare an entangled state. And this is where all the funky things happen, where you prepare a state which is inherently correlated with each other. And if you have entangled states, then what you can get is actually that it no more goes as square root of n, but it actually goes as 1 over n. And this is going beyond the standard quantum limit of quantum measurement. And this is truly where quantum metrology or quantum standard or quantum sensing really comes into the picture. So till the point here, this was all classical except or quantum 1.2, I would say, because you're using a quantum system to do a measurement, but the ultimate result that you will get is still limited by the classical laws. But when you go to this step, where you have created states which are highly correlated with each other, they sense phase in a much better way. And that's when you get a 1 over n kind of an advantage. this is really the crux of quantum sensing, that if you use states which are prepared in a certain strategy, then you can actually harness and go beyond the standard quantum limit. And you can also, of course, use longer coherent time systems to do better and better measurement to go to the beyond the standard quantum limit. So the question then remains, what defines this quantum Cramer-Rao bound? Or what is this quantum Cramer-Rao bound or Cramer-Rao bound? Okay, and what gives me this sort of an sensitivity estimate? Okay. So to understand this, we now have to go to quantum estimation theory, and I'm going to give a very, very simplified picture of quantum estimation theory here. We are not going to go into any depth, just going to be a very, very simplified understanding of this. And then before even going to the quantum estimation theory, we actually have to have a better estimate of the classical Fisher information. Just one sec, Atri, I actually just need to take one call. Just give me 2 seconds. I will just get back. So,
Ma'am, your voice is muted, ma'am. No, ma'am, no, ma'am. You have muted yourself, ma'am.
okay, can you hear me again?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you're audible.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am. You are audible, ma'am.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am. You are audible, ma'am.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You're audible now.
Can you hear me?
Dr. Kasturi, you are audible.
Yeah, okay. So I will just go back again. Yeah, okay. So when we talk about this quantum estimation theory, we'll first start with classical Fisher information, because that is the information that we have to see. When we are doing parameter estimation, you have to have an understanding of the kind of, what is the process of parameter estimation and what is the kind of information that I'm looking for to assess what are the bounds in the system, okay? So to do that, there is a very well-known classical information theory, and I'm sure many of you would have heard of Shannon's name and Shannon entropy. So the information content I contained in the target system about an event. Sorry, can you hear me again?
All the participants, please mute your phone. Mute your microphone.
Yeah. Okay, so event with a probability pi is defined as the Shannon solution to the fundamental property. So it's essentially that if you have a probability distribution, which is, if you can see here, let me again go to present pointer. Yeah. The probability distribution of whatever parameter that you're trying to measure, this is given by, say, some variable that you're trying, x, that you're trying to measure, that has a probability distribution p, and minus log p essentially is carrying that information, or the Shannon's information or entropy is what we usually refer to as, okay? So this is a non-negative quantity, and these are just things that are standard in the information terminology, right? So if you have
two different independent events that you have measured, then the total net probability is going to be just the sum of the two probabilities here. All right. Now we have to define what is known as the score. So what is the score? So score is the derivative of the Shannon's information with respect to an unknown parameter theta to be estimated. Okay. So like the example that we started off with is, if you want to estimate temperature, for instance, right? How do you estimate temperature? Let's take a thermocouple. I'm sure many of you would have heard about a thermocouple. So what does a thermocouple do? You touch the thermocouple to whatever system that you want to measure the temperature of, and then that it actually flows energy between the thermocouple and the surface that it is touching, and from the flow of energy to the thermocouple, you are estimating the temperature. You're not directly measuring the temperature, but you're estimating the temperature based on some measurement that you're doing of the energy, right? So there is a probability density of, or probability of probability distribution of the energy that you're measuring. And what the score is saying is that you cannot just look at this probability, but you actually have to see how that probability changes with what you want to measure, right? If that energy change is also dependent on some other parameters, then you have to see the model of how the energy is actually connected with the temperature, and only then how is it really changing with the temperature. So this is what the score is really telling you. The score tells you that you have to look at the derivative of that. So it is the derivative with respect to theta of minus log p, and this is what is known as the so here the probability distribution of the detection event x depends on the parameter theta. So essentially probability of measurement of x or rather measurement of theta, given that you have this p of x, right? So this is what is given as the score. And the property of score is that it is zero and average. On average, it is always zero. But what is not average is actually the variance. And this is known as the Fisher information or the classical Fisher information. So what you have to do is take the the double derivative and really calculate the this variance of this score, and this is called the J, which is also known as the so Fisher information J about an unknown parameter theta in a detected signal x is the variance of the score. Now, of course, this is a very hard statement to understand, but we will just take a very quick example and go back to the same temperature measurement, or I'll give you one more example of very classical measurement. So, but this quantity Fisher information is at the heart of any quantum sensing, or any, even before you go to quantum sensing, any kind of sensing or in estimation theory that you want to study. So if you really want to go and dig deep into the math of estimation theory, it is all about understanding the probability distributions of how the parameter that you're trying to estimate is really related to the the measurement that you're going to do, and then building the model of that measurement will tell you exactly how well you can measure that parameter. So that is at the heart of the estimation theory that we have to understand. So Fisher information is a special measure of information in observed data that is specifically related to the parameter of interest. Okay, let's take an example. Now it will become clear if you take an example here. So this is a plot of these are actually single photons that these are emitters actually. In fact, quantum emitters measured through a confocal system. And forget about all different things. What you have is actually, what you're seeing is just an image of photons that are collected in spatially. So with X and Y, you collect some photons, and you can see some bright spots here, some not so bright spots here, etc. But suppose I want to estimate in the real physical emitter space. So suppose my, say, quantum dot was emitting this number of photon, and I was measuring this. I want to assess what is the exact location of my emitter. But what I'm measuring is not my emitter position directly, but what I'm measuring is the fluorescence that it emits And from the fluorescence it emits, I have to estimate what the position of my emitter is going to be, right? So the parameter theta that I'm trying to image is the is somebody has to mute, I think. So the parameter theta is the position of the quantum dot that I'm supposed to image in my image plane. But what I'm going to measure is actually the x, which is the position of the detected photon. So if I just take a line cut across this, blurb that you see, you'll actually get an intensity or a probability distribution of the intensity that I measure with respect to the position that I'm about to measure. So as you can see, you have a p of x versus the x, and this is a very nice Gaussian function. So it's a good starting point for you to see how this is related to the Fisher information. So ultimately, I want to estimate x, but estimate the position theta of this in the image plane. But I can measure is a very distributed function. Okay, so let's go back to the math that we started out with, which is essentially what is the Shannon's information. Now you have a very nice function p of x. P of x is a Gaussian. You can take the log and you can find out what the score, this score is. So once you find out the score, from the score you can actually estimate finally the Fisher information. And what is interesting to note is that J is actually inversely related to the variance. Look at sigma is usually the variance. So you can see here that J is inversely related to the variance. What does this really mean? It means that if your variance is small or if your J is large, then your variance is small, right? If your variance is small, then you have a better detection of your position. So what do you want to do? You want to maximize J so that your variance is small. Now, but at the heart of all of this is the P of x. You must know what relates P of x to the actual estimation or the theta parameter that you really want to estimate. So x here you can see from here. So this is really at the crux of estimation theory, or this is classical Fisher information. It already tells you that how well can I estimate the parameter or the position of my emitter really depends on if I can minimize this variance, meaning if I could get a detector that could detect with very precise sort of very narrow variance or very small variance here, then my detection becomes much better, right? And this is a mathematical way of understanding what the estimation theory really tells you, or quantifying what the estimation is. And as you can already see that this is where any kind of estimation can be related to. Right. Now, for an observed x data, we will estimate theta with a conversion factor of this kind of a model, which is what I was mentioning. So there must be a good model or an unbiased estimator, right? So is there a model for an unbiased estimator? How accurate is my model and what are the confidence bounds, right? So what is it that I'm really bounded by? So ultimately it is the bound is essentially nothing but the variance, so which is 1 over j, and is theta really equal to x is a good estimator. So basically the fact that the mean of x is equal to theta, which is essentially what we are saying here, the fact that we are using this model, is this truly applicable to every system that we are trying to assess? Probably not. But what we have to understand is that we can find out a model that can really relate the parameter that we are trying to estimate to what we can measure. And that is where that information is captured, or how you want to design that measurement is really in minimizing this variance sigma, which is essentially maximizing my J. Okay. So I won't go much more into detail of this, but I'll give you one more example and go back and link to the temperature measurement that we were discussing about. So let's say we have a black body that is emitting radiation. We all know the black body radiation has a profile like this. Now I want to measure the temperature and at a given wavelength. So given this is the plot of intensity versus the wavelength. All right, so as you can see, I would naturally think that okay, my best measurement would be at the point where I have the highest intensity of radiation, and so if I can measure here, I will be able to make a better estimation, right? Which is in this case, let's connect it back to the our estimation theory. So theta mu is equal to T, which is the temperature of the target. And then X is essentially, or the probability distribution is nothing but my intensity I related to my lambda here. So what I'm trying to measure is the temperature T given the intensity profile like this. Now the question that I want to ask is, what is the best place for me to measure the temperature? Okay, so for doing this, I will calculate my J, and you see that it is finally related to the delta T. So it is the change of the intensity with temperature. So see this, if I take the derivative of this plot, what I get is something like this. Now what you see is that this point is actually not the maximum point here. This point is actually the slope point here. So it's very counterintuitive when you think about measurement. The most accurate measurement is not necessarily where you have the highest signal, but where you have the maximum change in the signal with respect to the parameter that you're trying to measure. So this is really at the heart of any kind of measurement, whether it is quantum or classical. And especially as we talk about, I'll just quickly go to the what is the quantum counterpart of this, that to estimate a parameter, you have to choose very wisely where you want to estimate that parameter. So what you want to see is that the rate of change of that parameter with respect to what you're trying to measure is what you have to assess, and that is the point. So as you can see, the slope point is the best point where I will get my highest J, which means my lowest variance. So that is what we usually use. And so most of the time you will see people do talk about slope detection and not maxima detection or minima detection. Okay, so slope detection is the highest point of sensitivity, or meaning the smallest change here, as you can see, a very tiny change in my wavelength will lead to a very large change in my slope. So, or the signal. So this is where I want to sit down and do the measurements, and this can be mathematically understood from what is known as the Fisher information. Now what is the quantum analog of this? So the quantum analog is very simple. As you go to the quantum system, you don't talk about Shannon entropy, but you talk about von Neumann entropy. And here, instead of using the probability X distribution, the P of X, which is the probability distribution, we talk about the rho, which is the density operator. Okay, the density operator, which is actually describing my system. Now density operator, as we know, is the true signature information of my system. Or density operator, once you write down the density matrix of a system, you essentially have every component captured within of that system. So in this case, the von Neumann entropy is nothing but the trace rho ln rho, and this, in this case, you have to remember that this is an operator. No more this is just a simple probability distribution, but this is an operator. And as you can see, that when the operator is diagonal, or if there is only diagonal components and no off diagonal components, there is no correlation, and so it's a very non-correlated system. You actually will not be able to maximize J. So let's look at what is then the counterpart of the the score, as well as finally what is the quantum bound or the Fisher information. Or so in this case, what you have, remember, is an operator. And so in here you cannot just take the derivative just like that, because you have to ensure that this is symmetric and L is Hermitian. So you don't write the score as a delta anymore, but we write it as an L theta, and this has to be symmetrized to ensure that you maintain the Hermitian property and also the properties of your density matrix. And this is just a mathematical way of ensuring that you take care of all your quantum mechanical things in the system. And what we find is that, again, just like the average of score is 0, so similarly average of this L theta, which is the quantum score, is also equal to 0. Okay, so then the quantum Fisher information is now nothing but the variance, which is L theta L L. So L theta L dagger, and mathematically it can be written as the trace rho L theta L. So in analog to just like the classical Cramer-Rao bound, here the quantum Cramer-Rao bound is nothing but this, that variance of theta must be greater than equal to 1 over k. Now this is just the quantum version of the classical estimation theory that we have already understood so far. So this again, these are a little bit of math that is there. So finally, you just have to diagonalize and make sure everything works out. And what we finally get is k mu nu. Now, why we have mentioned mu nu here is that because there could be many different parameters also, and so there could be multiple different relations. Finally, all of this, if there are off diagonal information is not present, then all of it will become simplified, and the classical and the quantum will match with each other. There is no mismatch in the quantum versus classical information at all. Okay, just to summarize, we have a classical score which is given by this expression. Similarly, you have a quantum score. In this case, you just have to represent it by the density matrix or the density operator. And here we have a quantum score. So similarly, you have a classical Fisher information, which is nothing but the variance of the score. And for the quantum, you have a quantum Fisher information, which is given by this. Now you have a classical Cramer-Rao bound, which is nothing but the variance of this whatever mu theta that you're trying to measure must be greater than 1 over j, or you must try to maximize j and minimize the variance, and that is the same as this Cramer-Rao bound. Now if we relate this back to the expression of the B that we were trying to measure, you essentially want to minimize the variance in your system and maximize the Fisher information. So quantum Fisher information is a generalization of the classical Fisher information, and the density matrix approach can generalize the concept of Shannon entropy. So this, in a very simplified way, is at the heart of quantum estimation, and it tells you that quantum estimation, or how you set up your measurement, is very non-intuitive, and it is better to understand what is the best way to do the measurement. So to just sum up, if you have a quantum sensing protocol, what would you really do? Now you know that for a qubit there is the DiVincenzo's criteria, which is essentially saying that if you have how will you do a quantum computing protocol, that if you have a qubit that can be very, very nicely initialized, then it can be controlled, and then you can do some measurements, and then you should be able to read out the state. That is what the standard DiVincenzo's criteria. So similarly to just like the DiVincenzo's criteria for quantum computing system, you also have a protocol for quantum sensing, or quantum criteria for sensing is that you should be able to initialize the system. Then you should be able to apply some kind of a unitary transformation. For instance, in the example we started off with, which is measurement of the B field through the Hamiltonian, the Zeeman Hamiltonian, that is the unitary that we're talking about. You let the state evolve over time with this Hamiltonian, and then you do a state transformation, and then finally you do a projection readout of the state, and you repeat this measurement many times, because this is there's a probability associated with the measurement, and then finally you estimate the signal. Now how well you estimate the signal is essentially given by the quantum Cramer-Rao bound of the signal. So this is what the final quantum sensing protocol really means. Ultimately, if you really go into the true quantum metrology, you have to prepare entangled states, and preparing and measuring entangled states are very, very difficult and very challenging. And so you will find very rare situations where people are actually using these kind of measurement techniques, atomic clocks, ion traps. These are all different types of examples. I will give you some examples tomorrow as well. Then you have parameter spatial inhomogeneity. There are many different types of inhomogeneities that are possible. We are also limited by the qubits coherence time, but because you remember that, as I mentioned, the sensing is a double-edged sword. You have to have the fidelity to be able to measure, which is enough amount of coherence time so that you can repeat the measurement many number of times. But you should also not have a qubit that is so well protected that it never sees the environment itself, right? So there is a catch-22 situation here, and then you can do some parameter variation according to this. Ultimately, sensing quantum systems even more challenging. Okay, so you have a lot of different complicated things that are happening all together. At the heart of it is the quantum sensing and quantum Cramer-Rao bound that you have to be aware of. So, in summary, in today's lecture, what you heard was about classical sensors, the type of noise detection, etc., which you have to be aware of, because when you're quantifying a sensor, you have to first understand what your classical noise are, and then go build on top of them to understand your quantum noise. And classical and quantum parameter estimation, which is essentially your quantum Fisher information and your classical Fisher information. And you see that the quantum Fisher information is just a generalization of the classical Fisher. Whatever I have spoken today can be found in in two different places. One is the this review lecture on quantum sensing itself, and then there are other lectures that are available on the web as well. Okay, I can stop sharing and maybe take a few questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that inspiring session and speaking today despite being unwell. We really appreciate your effort and hope you feel better soon, ma'am. We are now open for a few questions from the audience. Please feel free to raise your hand or share your question in the chat.